All right, let's get going. So this is not a security boundary, breaking forest trust. We're going to hit some Active Directory stuff, trust. This is a very interesting bug that has now since been patched by Microsoft. We'll explain the patch and kind of the behavior and everything that fixed it, but we're going to walk you through all the components that are going to be needed to really understand what this issue was, how we kind of went about finding it, and how it got fixed. So my name is Will Schrader. My handle on Twitter and GitHub is Harmjoy. I am a technical architect at SpectreOps. I've written a lot of the code over the years, helped out Veil Framework, Empire, PowerSploit, Bloodhound, a whole bunch of fun stuff. And the one project that I've written that will be used in these demos is Rubius for a lot of C# Kerberos exploitation.
And my name is Lee Christensen. I'm also a technical architect over at SpectreOps. I do a lot of red teaming. I do a bunch of tool development, research, a lot of Windows internal stuff as well, and a bunch of training there as well for the red team class. In general, I just love shiny things. Anything that's interesting in security, I'm more than happy to dive into and research.
All right, so forest and security boundaries. Security boundaries is a concept in Microsoft that's actually pretty well defined, to where outside of something that might be a security feature like UAC, to where fixes or bypasses won't be serviced, security boundaries are supposed to be serviced if there's some kind of violation. The classic is going to be like local privilege escalation. So for years in documentation, Microsoft's own docs, this is the what are domains and forest docs, they explicitly talk about forest as security boundaries, to where all the objects from one forest, if you compromise everything in Forest A, you're not supposed to be able to then use that access to compromise, say, something in another forest. So there was some, I think, confusion about exactly, even on the Microsoft side, about how they were going to treat forests as actual security boundaries, and if this was going to be treated in the same way that they would for host-based local privilege escalation and things like that. But we're going to explore this kind of in the journey, and we're going to explain exactly why forests were thought of or functioned as security boundaries and how we violated some of those assumptions. So this is kind of the general scenario, is what if a computer in Forest A authenticates to a computer in Forest B, where there's a two-way forest-to-forest trust in the realm of Active Directory. And what if full ticket granting tickets, TGTs, could move across the trust boundary between Forest A and Forest B? And what if we had a way to easily extract and reuse these ticket granting tickets in the forest we control? Bonus points if we can force the authentication step. So instead of just waiting where we are, what if we could coerce a domain controller or another system to then authenticate to us on a capture target? This is essentially the mad recipe that we're going to go over that has to do with unconstrained delegation, delegation TGTs flowing over trust boundaries in specific types of ways over specific trusts, and we're going to wrap everything up with the printer bug that we talked about, or Lee talked about last year when we were on stage. But first, we have to explain Kerberos in 60 seconds or maybe a couple of minutes.
So there's no way that we can go into the detail that we really want to explain all of Kerberos. You know, it's not that complex, really. Wink, wink. But it's a dense topic. We're just going to rush through it really quick. We do highly recommend Sean Metcalf's post online. It goes into very good detail about how Kerberos works. So that's there for reference. When you log onto a computer, the very first thing that you do is you send, essentially you take a timestamp, you take a timestamp and you encrypt it with a hash that's associated with your password. And you send that timestamp to the domain controller, and it validates that it was encrypted with your password. Assuming that the timestamp was correctly encrypted, the domain controller is going to return to you what's called a ticket granting ticket. Once you have this ticket, this is proved that you've been authenticated within the domain. This ticket also contains something inside of it called the pack, which is essentially a piece of information that identifies you. So it has your unique identifier and the unique identifier of all the groups that you're a part of within the domain. These are your SIDs, your group SIDs and your user SID. This pack, you may be thinking in your head, this TGT was sent back to me from the domain controller. Why can't I just modify it and claim I'm anybody in the environment? Well, the reason why you can't is because it's encrypted using the KRB TGT account's password hash, which is only present on domain controllers. So, an attacker with access to a TGT cannot just, decrypt it and start tampering with these SIDs, the user SID and the group SIDs, because they're encrypted with that TGT account, which only the domain controller has. So you have this TGT, and now you want to access another resource in the environment. So what we do is we issue what's called a service ticket request. We present our TGT to the domain controller saying, hey, I would like to access some service. So let's say like a file share. We present the TGT to the domain controller. It validates that it's correct. And if it is correct, it returns to us a service ticket. And then we use that service ticket to authenticate to whatever service. We present it to the service. It also contains a PAC, that structure that identifies us. And so we present that to the service, and it looks at who we are, the groups we're a part of, and depending on, if we're authorized or not, like, do we have access to this file share, it'll grant or deny us access to that service.
Kerberos, everyone understands now.
Yep. There you go. You're all experts, just as smart as us. Yay. I wish it was that easy. Just as we slightly lied, it's not quite that easy. There's a few extra steps, especially when we start talking about inter-domain or multiple domains and forest trusts. In particular, so this is another way of looking at it. Step one here, we're talking about using that's when we send the timestamp to the domain controller. Step two, it returns our TGT. Step three, though, is when we're trying to authenticate to a service in another domain. A different process occurs here. We say, hey, we want to access this file share that's in a different domain, and rather than returning a service ticket immediately, our domain controller returns a referral TGT. That referral TGT is encrypted with an inter-realm trust key. So when a trust gets established, that key is generated, and then we receive a TGT that's encrypted with that. Then we present that TGT to the other domain's domain controller, saying, hey, we want to access the service in your domain, and then that domain controller returns a service ticket for that file share. So a little more complicated, but not too bad. There we go. You're experts now.
Right, so that's the Kerberos 101. There's a second part in Active Directory that's a really useful or needed thing in a lot of operations called delegation, meaning when you need to pretend to be another user, impersonate them to a different service. For example, the canonical example is when a user, say, a web application, and that web application needs to impersonate or pretend to be that person to, say, a backend database. So this is a common scenario that arises in enterprises and arises in these architectures, because we've talked to some people and they're like, why is delegation even enabled in AD? Just for the same reason you can do token impersonation on hosts. Like, this is a needed primitive where certain services need to be able to impersonate and pretend to be other users to a different service. Okay. The way Microsoft implemented this is 3 different flavors. There's unconstrained delegation, traditional constrained delegation, and resource-based constrained delegation. Unconstrained was their first take at it. It's been in Microsoft Active Directory since Windows 2000, or at 2000 domain functional level. Traditional constrained was in 2003, and resource-based constrained delegation was in 2012. All 3 of these delegation types have different attacks, or not vulnerabilities, but different kind of operational attacks that are associated with them. We're not going to cover the constrained and resource-based constrained, though they are quite interesting. We're only going to hit unconstrained, where if you have a server configured for unconstrained delegation, then when a user requests a service ticket for it, they have a forwarded version of their ticket granting ticket that's stuffed into the request and presented to the target. This means that if an attacker controls a server with unconstrained delegation, then anyone that authenticates to it, their TGT will be cached in memory on that unconstrained server, and you can extract it out and pretend to be that person. So this is dangerous because control of an unconstrained server, along with a couple other primitives, can result in complete domain or forest compromise. Microsoft knew that this was, like, unconstrained delegation, it's needed just on domain controllers by default within the domain, so there's always at least one system in a domain that has this. But we've seen many times where people had, like, provisioning problems, or They just didn't realize, like, oh, all workstations of these servers all have unconstrained delegation, because there weren't fully weaponized attack chains until this past year that actually let you abuse this in a really, really effective way. But again, compromise of an unconstrained server, you can extract out the TGT of anyone that connects to it. It's kind of like a water hole, type of attack. And again, like I mentioned, DCs are the only ones configured by default for this, but there are often misconfigurations you can see in the field for this.
We've been in environments where we've seen every single computer, for whatever reason, being granted unconstrained delegation rights. So we've been able to use this to elevate just from a normal workstation.
And when we talked about this, combined with the printer bug, which we'll go over, like we talked about last year, we realized that control of a unconstrained server can result in the compromise of the entire domain. But then we started researching this a bit more and dove in and realized there's implications for forest trust as well. And this is just kind of what it looks like from an LDAP property type level. You can really easily enumerate any systems that have unconstrained delegation. It's just a bit flag in the user account control settings for any computer object. It's also very, very difficult to flip this bit. Like if you have control of your own object, you can't just go in and flip it and somehow take over the domain. There's a very special privilege that by default only domain administrators have, and that privilege is needed, SE-enabled delegation, is needed to modify any delegation settings in Active Directory objects, because modification of any delegation stuff could result in complete domain compromise. Let's say we're on, this primary machine is trusted for delegation, unconstrained, and say someone who's a DA just lists the file share on that remote server, then their full ticket granting ticket is going to be, for at least a period of time, will be in memory on that primary system. Cool. All right, that's the second part. Kerberos, and then delegation. Now we're going to hit trusts.
So domain trusts, what are they? So trusts, all they are is they are a way for to link authentication systems in Active Directory. So you may have several different domains, and all a trust does is it allows you to link those two domains together. So essentially, users from domain A can now authenticate to resources in domain B. There's various different kinds of trusts, and how a trust actually works underneath is when the trust gets created, there's this thing called an inter-realm trust key that's created, and that's used to encrypt the Kerberos referral tickets that are created. So essentially, if I'm trying to access a resource in another domain, I'm going to say, hey, domain controller, I want to access the file share over in Will's domain, and it's going to send me a TGT encrypted with that inter-realm trust key. And then I'm going to use that referral TGT and send it to Will's domain, and he'll return a service ticket to me. So that's essentially the referral process that occurs whenever there's trust. This only occurs when it's going between separate domains. When it comes to trust, there's a couple different concepts that we want to talk about. The first is the direction of the trust and transitivity. So the first one that we'll talk about is a one-way trust. So this is just saying, I have a domain, Will has a domain, and I say, I trust Will. That means any users in Will's domain can, authenticate into my domain because I trust him. Likewise, trust can be bidirectional or two-way. That means, I trust him and he trusts me. Therefore, the users in my domain can authenticate to resources in his domain and vice versa. Then there's the idea of transitive trust. So, there's me, there's Will, and then there's another domain over there. Well, if I trust Will and Will trusts that domain, then by transitivity, that domain trusts me. So that's transitivity. In addition to direction and transitivity, there's different kinds of trusts. So there's intra-forest trusts, which are typically like parent-child or cross-link. And then there's the inter-domain trusts. So if you have two different Active Directory forests and you want to link them together, you'll set up a forest trust. Likewise, you could also have an external trust creating there. And the thing about, with external trust, they are non-transitive, so you can't just immediately access into them. So recall that when we receive a TGT from a domain controller, inside of that TGT is a structure called the PAC, the Privileged Account, or what is it, attribute? Yeah, Privileged Attribute Certificates, PAC. Yeah, there we go. What this actually looks like on the inside is there's a few different fields that we're really interested in. So like the very first one is the user. That identifies who we are within the domain. It also contains the groups that we're a part of. Those are the SIDs of each of the groups. And then maybe the extra SIDs. And this is, if we're authenticating to any remote domains. This is going to be in the, potentially in the extra SIDs. It's also used in SID history. And so idea being here, this is how we are identified within Active Directory using Kerberos. This identifies us and our privileges as a user. Why this is important and why all these SIDs that we mentioned here are important is because when it comes to setting up trusts, there's a protection that Active Directory has called SID filtering. So whenever you authenticate to another domain, this SID filtering process occurs. Essentially, when we try and authenticate to another domain, the other domain looks at the SIDs inside of our PAC and will potentially remove some of those SIDs before granting us access into the domain. And which SIDs get removed depends on the type of trust that's created. So inside of a domain, the SIDs are filtered differently than if there's a forest trust. So the type of filtering is going to change depending on the type of trust. And so a good example of this is, let's say I have my own forest and Will has his own forest. If I try and authenticate into Will's forest, I could claim that I have SIDs from like maybe the enterprise administrators group for Will's forest. But when I try and authenticate over there, SID filtering is going to remove the enterprise admin SIDs from my group SIDs or my extra SIDs. And that's due to this SID filtering protection that's inside of Active Directory. That being said, like you can still pretend to be I could pretend to be any user inside of my current domain. And if those users have been granted access to resources in Will's domain, I could potentially escalate privileges, but I can't instantly become an enterprise administrator because that SID is filtered when we crossed that forest trust. So that's why when we're talking about, what is the boundary inside of Active Directory, the reason why the forest is the security boundary is due to this SID filtering. It's going to remove any of those SIDs when we go into a different domain. A really good overview of SID filtering, Derbycon has a really good link down there at the bottom if you're interested in what it actually looks like. Like we said, ultimately SID filtering across trusts is to stop a compromised, trusted forest or domain from compromising a trusting forest. So what do we mean by that? Will may trust me. There may be a trust between us, but if I'm compromised, if my domain is compromised, SID filtering should, the keyword is should there, should prevent me from immediately compromising his domain. And that's why, again, that's why it's the boundary inside of Active Directory.
All right, so for a long time, Microsoft has explicitly stated and told anybody that the domain itself is not a security boundary. The reason it's not a security boundary is because of how SID filtering is applied for domains within the same forest. This is a screenshot of some of the SID filtering rules that we had linked. And there is a specific one called forest specific, where SIDs are never allowed in a PAC that originate from outside of the forest, but they are honored within the same forest. So if you have domain A, B, and C within the same forest, then the enterprise admin SID is allowed to cross those boundaries as long as the domains are in the same forest. So this seems like a weird nitty-gritty subtle type thing, but the reason that this is awesome is a couple years ago, Sean Metcalf and Delpy realized the implications of these types of things, which I'll cover in a second. But again, SID of enterprise admins, not filtered out by default for inter-realm tickets if both domains are in the same forest. So if you can somehow set either your SID history, which is a property on Active Directory users that allowed for like different migrations and stuff. But if you can set the SID history or the extra SIDs in a ticket to somehow be enterprise admins and you're in a child domain, you can instantly compromise the forest root and everything in the same forest. And this is exactly what Delpy and Sean figured out and weaponized. So for a long time, people knew this as a vulnerability because if you could somehow modify that property on an object in a child domain, you could have complete forest compromise. But there wasn't weaponization for it, really, because it's very, very difficult to modify the SID history on any active user or group in an Active Directory domain database. Until Delpy realized, and Sean, like, oh, if you're creating golden tickets, why don't we just add this extra SID and then we can hop up immediately? We have our obligatory, like, Delpy jumping in. All right. So when I first learned about this attack, it kind of blew my mind. I've been doing a lot of trust stuff. This happened several years ago. And it allows us to where if you compromise domain administrator credentials for any child domain in the forest for 5 minutes, you can then compromise everything in the entire forest. But SID filtering for sensitive groups does protect across forest trust boundaries. This is why forests were established as a security boundary, at least as far as we can tell. Obviously, we're not from Microsoft. But there's a couple more side notes. So now that's most of kind of some of the technical background. There's a couple of side notes we noticed in documentation that let us start putting this cool attack together. The first one is that when you're authenticating from forest A to forest B, you always receive a new identifier called authenticated users in your new token when you're authenticating against the other forest. So if Lee's in his forest and authenticates and gets a referral to mine, he's going to automatically get the authenticated user SID for my forest put into his referral. This is important, or it comes into play later on. So any user in either trust can perform any action that domain authenticated users can. For example, querying LDAP or Doom, whatever else. And also, side note on delegation and trust, this is until recently, until a couple months ago, is that when full delegation is enabled, the server can use delegated TGTs to connect as any user to any server, including those across a one-way trust. So what this means is that delegated ticket granting tickets could flow across trust boundaries. So like, why should you give a crap about all this stuff? Like, why does this matter? So delegated TGTs can be used across forest trust boundaries. And a compromised unconstrained delegation server means that an attacker can extract TGTs of users who authenticate to that machine, even if they connect from another forest up until a few months ago. And what if we could coerce particular accounts in one forest to authenticate to an unconstrained server that we control? Like, I wonder if this would be possible.
Yes, we can. So that's where the printer bug comes into play. So, our problem here is we want to be able to coerce, any, a privileged account to authenticate to an unconstrained server. And so the printer bug is a nice little thing that I discovered. It abuses an old printer protocol, the MSRPRN protocol. And what it does is inside of that RPC protocol, there's a couple different methods that I saw. RPC remote find first printer change notification. I mean, doesn't that sound just like such a great method? But essentially what I found when looking through the protocol spec is that when invoked, when you use this method, what happens is, I call this method against Will's computer, and upon doing that, his machine immediately connects back to me. And this is because it's essentially what this method is supposed to do. It's supposed to be used for printers to notify me of when things happen with that printer. So like saying I want Will's printer to notify me whenever a new print job occurs. Then it would connect back to me and notify me. But that's the legitimate use case. We can of course use that to coerce authentication. That's what we're interested in as an attacker. So it's worth noting that this is just one way. We already know that there are other ways to do this, so don't think this is the only way. So like we said, MSRPRN, just a few details about it. It uses the SMB RPC protocols using named pipes. There's some of the details around it. But the important thing here is that we can invoke that method as an authenticated user. So remember, authenticated users, when you authenticate over a trust boundary, you are granted the authenticated user's SID. So we can use this method against machines in other forests and coerce those machines to authenticate to anywhere we want. Also want to give a shout out to Elad Shamir. He also independently discovered this a little bit after me. As far as I know, this bug still works. It doesn't work less than 8 because it was enabled, as far as I can tell on Windows 8 and above, it works just fine. We used it on an op just a couple weeks ago to compromise a forest and still worked on a 2016 server, so it should still work. Don't know about 2019 yet. So in order to exploit this, I created a tool called Spool Sample. The spooler, come on. But anyways, Spool Sample is we've got an example of it running here. So on that first line, you can see that we're on a machine called Win10. I'm running as a marketer, which is just a low privileged account in the network. And I'm running Spool Sample against a domain controller, the lab DC, and I'm saying, please authenticate back to my Windows 10 machine. And so I go ahead and execute it. And then I use seatbelt to just list the logon events. And as you can see, on the Windows 10 machine, we can see that the domain controller did indeed try and authenticate back to us. And we can see there that it's using Kerberos when it did that authentication. We could also force it to use NTLM, but in this case, we're just going to use Kerberos. So that's very cool. That's an extremely powerful primitive, especially in this scenario.
All right, we're going to put all the pieces together. So, in this scenario, say an attacker completely compromises Forest B. So this is also going to include, by guarantee to have compromise of at least one server with unconstrained delegation, which would be the domain controller for Forest B. Let's say Forest B shares a two-way Forest trust with Forest A. So theoretically, based on this being a boundary, compromise of Forest B should not be able to facilitate compromise of any resources in Forest A. We're going to use, in this demo, we're going to use Rubius for TGT monitoring and extraction, Spool Sample for the coerced authentication, and then Mimikatz with DC sync. There's only a few steps. There's not actually too many moving parts. So, okay, we have our victim forest, which is A, and we've compromised everything in Forest B. First, as a domain attacker, via the print spooler stuff, the MSRPRN, I'm going to tell the domain controller in Forest A, please authenticate to me on domain controller B. Domain controller A, with its machine account, will authenticate to B. These two parts are what compromises the printer bug. And it sends its ticket granting ticket, because of unconstrained delegation, it'll send a completely forwarded ticket granting ticket over that Forest trust boundary. Then, all the attacker does is extract that ticket granting ticket of DCA, domain controller. They can resubmit it to the local security authority on their box. And now they're a DC. And they can just DC sync any account they want in Forest A, because now it is if they are DCA, the domain controller.
Worth noting here that nowhere do you see SID filtering take place.
So that's the entire attack kind of laid out, and we're going to show a demo video of this. So again, A has a two-way trust with B. We're just proving it. I promise, we're not lying. We didn't fake out the demo. We're on the domain controller we control. We are going to start monitoring for new ticket granting tickets coming in. This will just actually monitor the 464 logon events. Then we're going to trigger the printer bug against DCA, saying please connect to DCB. We get DCA's ticket granting ticket that's extracted out as a base 64 blob. We're going to take this ticket out, just remove the new line so then we can resubmit it. You could automate this even more, I suppose, if you'd like. And just as an FYI, we will post the slides for this and tweet it out right after the talk is over. So we get that base 64 of DCA's ticket granting ticket. We can verify that this is real by parsing the ticket structures with Rubius and then verifying the information within it. So okay, this is for DCA, $ for the machine account of the domain controller. We're going to submit that ticket granting ticket to LSA. Now it is as if we are DCA $, the machine account. Then all we have to do left is DC sync any account we want, say the KRB TGT, of that trusting forest. Dope, that was the entire attack. This is actually the demo video for proof of concept that we sent in to Microsoft when we filed this. So the TLDR of this is if you compromise any server with unconstrained delegation, domain controller or otherwise, you can use that access with the printer bug to compromise the current domain, all domains in your current forest, and until recently, all domains in any foreign forest that there's a two-way forest trust with. So some people didn't really think that this was a big deal. Some of the public reaction when we posted this was, still a security boundary as long as there's not a two-way trust, which, okay, I guess I kind of disagree. Or step 1, have forest root domain admin credentials. Step 2, have things grossly misconfigured, because I guess having a trust is a gross misconfiguration. Or I don't think I've heard anyone claim a boundary still exists when a two-way trust is in place, to which we kind of respond with the way people kind of were thinking about this. We're like, why call the forest a security boundary if, like, why even have it as a security boundary unless it's in the context of trust with other domains? So we kind of disagree with some of this, but we understand why. It's a complex issue with a lot of subtleties, so we understand why, people kind of viewed it this way.
Yep. And so, like, the big thing here is, in Active Directory's default configuration, it is vulnerable. So you can, if one forest trusts another forest, then the compromise of that first forest is going to result in the compromise of the second forest. So the issue here is, like, you have this dependency now on the security of this, untrusted forest that you're just assuming is okay, or is isolated off, but that is no longer the case. You cannot assume, I can't assume that Will's forest is, completely trustworthy now. So even if, I had perfect security, I did everything right just by virtue of having a trust between us. If Will's forest is compromised, then I am also compromised, or could be compromised.
So the reason that we think this matters or is impactful is especially with larger corporations that do, say, acquisitions, where they bring in new Active Directory resources, and then in order for things to intercommunicate, we'll just hook it up with a trust. And based on the guidance from Microsoft for years, they're like, okay, we're doing this right. We're doing a forest trust, because that's a security boundary, so we're not gonna be able to be compromised. And then if a single unconstrained server is compromised in that new domain they hooked up, the entire thing comes crashing down.
And we've seen this more than once in actual environments, so we knew from practical, experience that organizations were doing this. So we reported this last fall to MSRC. Initially, the engineering teams got back to us, and they claimed it was not an issue. It was by design. This is how it was designed. And we responded saying, no, we really do think this is an issue. Like, you should reconsider. Sure enough, they did not patch it. They said maybe we'll think about doing it in the future in a vNext patch, but no promises. So we went ahead and we decided to disclose it to the public. So we published this along with some really great defensive guidance. And sure enough, they decided it was a mistake at that point. So soon after that, an advisory was released talking about the issue that was at play here. And months later, in March, a patch was finally released. So while we didn't agree with their initial assessment, we do applaud Microsoft for actually admitting their error and handling it. And they ended up coming up with a really good patch, which we're going to talk about. But to their credit, they did admit it, and they owned up to the mistake. And so in March of this year, that's where CVE 2019-0683 came. just talking about how there's an elevation of privilege between Active Directory forests.
All right. So some of the details on what they actually did and why we think this is such a cool example of like really killing the entire fundamental issue instead of just doing like a little Band-Aid over it. So after they officially recognized it, they rolled a patch out over several months this year, and they did it in multiple steps. So, but in general, what it does now is it disables TGT delegation across forest trust boundaries by default. And the cool way they did it is there was an opt-in period where if you wanted to still allow this behavior in your environment, you're able to flip a bit and still have this existing type functionality. And then a few months after that, they completely disabled and like killed stuff by default, where unless you opted in to preserve this behavior, in all modern patch domains now, this thing is completely killed. So Microsoft very rarely breaks backwards compatibility by default. Usually the option would be, we're gonna give you something in this scenario that will let you disable this behavior. They very rarely go back in and then change the existing established architectural behavior of a system in a way that breaks backwards compatibility. So there's a very big deal that this happened. And as of July, they added a new safe configuration for unconstrained server delegations across trust. So how did this patch actually work under the hood? How did it roll out? So in modern 2012 domains, there was an option that you could disable TGT delegation across trust. It was an opt-in, it was an optional thing that you had to set. It was not turned on by default. So in March of this year, they backported that functionality to server 2008. That was step one. Then in May, they introduced a new trust flag. So trusts are actually represented as something called trusted domain objects in Active Directory. So in Lee's domain, if he trusts my domain, there's going to be an object of Will's domain represented as a trusted domain object in Lee's domain. So everything is an object in AD. It all has properties. This is how it knows, like, should I do this filtering or not, and all these different settings. So they introduced a new flag that was cross-organization enabled TGT delegation. This was the opt-in period, to where if you still wanted to preserve this behavior, you could flip this. They also, for any new trust, they flipped the old flag on by default. So cross-organization, no TGT delegation. So they let you opt in, and then they disabled the behavior by default and how it currently was. Then the big step is in July of 2019, they started enforcement of the new trust flag, and they're completely ignoring the old opt-in one. So if you did not, in that short period of time, flip this existing flag to preserve the functionality, now on patch domains, this just does not work anymore. Delegated TGTs will not flow between forest trusts. So forests are now, again, a security boundary. So the operational guidance, though, from an offensive or defensive standpoint, is if this one particular flag is set, the issue will be mitigated if that cross-organization no delegation is set. The issue completely is mitigated if all DCs are running server 2012, or if you have 2008 DCs, if they're patched as of March 2019, if they got that update, and you have this flag set. If you have the cross-organization enabled TGT flag set, then the whole domain setup is still vulnerable. But someone had to actively opt in to preserve this risky behavior in this risky setup. And if neither flag is set, which is going to be the most common, then you're vulnerable if the May 2019 update is not applied to every domain controller, which is kind of the trickier part. So once this kind of flipped on, we started seeing it slowly rolling out to different domain controllers or different environments. I think most environments are going to be protected now. As long as people are updating their domain controllers, they're good. There is a technical reference in some of the GitHub issues for Vincent Latou's Ping Castle project that we have a link down there, where someone actually reversed the patch and figured out these flags and figured out exactly what was happening. So I know we went a bit quick, but that's the talk. So thank you guys for coming out. We always love talking at Derbycon, and if there's any particular questions, we can take them, or if you want to come up and chat with us after, definitely can. We have a bunch of references and stuff, and again, we will upload this slide deck to SlideShare and then tweet out the link here within the next hour or so. So thank you guys.